The purpose of this video is to show you how to set up Revit to begin your next project, which is the Jefferson Beach Bungalow. The first part of this next project will be to replicate the foundation plan, which is what you see on your screen right here. So to do this, first you need to open an application of Revit. And when you do so, you should end up either in a window like this. And if that happens, you're going to go ahead and select New. Otherwise, if it doesn't open up this window, you should be able to come up here and it will allow you to go to a file and New as well. So we'll go ahead and let that open up. So when you're looking here at Revit, keep in mind that we have the tabs up here on the top. And from those tabs, we have the ribbon. And then down here we have our main workspace. And when I open this, after we create a new project, we'll have our properties window and we'll have our project browser window. When you create a new project, you have some templates to choose from. Now, in construction management, most of the time my students are tempted to use the construction template. That is not the template I want you to use. We're going to select here architectural template. Let me go back here for a second. You'll note there is 4 templates here. These templates were created and were downloaded as part of the Revit package. Any person has the ability to create their own templates, which is not part of this course, but you can create those templates and then use those templates when you start any project. So we're going to go ahead and select architectural template, make sure that we're creating a new project, not a project template. And we're going to go ahead and say OK. So as this opens up, let me just go back to kind of the fundamental issue that we need to think about when we're using Revit. Revit is a modeling software. So the essence of this is we're not drawing lines. You don't want to be thinking about we're drawing lines. We are actually placing objects. So that becomes very important because when we do our setup, what will end up happening is we need to set our setup, and so we're looking at the different planes. Maybe another way to put it is we work off of an XYZ axis system, and so when we start dealing with our objects, we're placing them to planes that exist on either the X, Y, or Z axis. So that becomes very important because you need to make sure that you know where you're at in your model when you are placing things. Okay, it looks like my computer is running a little slow here for a second, so I'm going to go ahead and pause this video until it's up and running. Okay, it looks like we're all loaded up now. So once again, as I was saying earlier, we have our tabs up here at the top. As you select the different tabs, that'll take you to the different ribbons. For the most part, what we'll be working on is the structure, but primarily we will be in the architecture ribbon. And then the modify ribbon we will use as well as annotate. But we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So as we're looking at this right here, this by default comes to level 1. I'm going to explain what you're looking at here really quickly, but level 1 is essentially a view. Okay, as we come over here to the left-hand side, this is what we call our properties window, and this is what we call our project browser window. Now, on occasion, I have students that accidentally, for some reason or another, they'll hit the X, and you'll notice that that property window goes away. If you ever run into that problem, the easiest way to fix that is to come up here to the View tab And all the way to the right, you'll see this user interface. I'm going to go ahead and select the down arrow, and we'll see that we have this box that's no longer checked that's called the properties. So I can go ahead and check mark that, and it will reappear. Really quickly before I move on, you'll notice we also have the project browser. So if you end up losing the project browser, which is on this area down here, then you can go through that same step to bring it back. Okay, so one of the nice things that they added, I believe it was Revit 2019, it could have been 2018, is they have these tabs that are actually the different views that you are looking at. That makes it very handy in terms of being able to go from view to view to view using the tabs, versus where traditionally in the classic view you would have to come down here and select each of the views from our project browser. So as we're looking here in the project browser, you'll see that by default under floor plans we have level 1, we have level 2, we have a site. We have ceiling plans. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that right now, but you will notice first off that we do have level 1, level 2. They coincide with the floor plans. These views are for what we refer to as reflected ceiling plans. We also have elevations, our building elevations, which by the template that's created, they are labeled as east, north, south, and west. And we've got a few things under there further, but I'm going to stop right there. Now, one of the things that we will do to set up and get ready to start drawing or modeling this Jefferson Beach bungalow, we are going to actually come in here and we are going to create some, or we're going to rename some of these descriptions. So I'm going to hover under floor plans level 1. I'm going to right click and go rename. On this rename, I'm going to call this, and I'm going to do this in all capital letters. I'll explain why I'll do that later on in these videos. I'm going to go main level floor plan. Get rid of that little box right there so you can see that. Now, when I click out of there, it's going to ask me a question. I should get a dialog box here that says, would you like to rename corresponding levels and views? For now, I want you guys to always say yes. Now, the reason that's important, we'll let it process here just for 1 second. But the reason that will be important is as soon as we see our floor plan renamed as main level floor plan, there we go. You'll notice it put it underneath level 2. That's because this always will organize in an alphanumeric sequencing. If I expand my ceiling plan, once again, that I minimized, what you'll notice is it also changed level 1 for the ceiling plan to main level floor plan. So if I would have said no on that question to rename, it would have left this at level 1. But for our cases right now, we want to simply keep that the same. Now, another thing, the reason I minimize the ceiling plan is it is easy at times if you're going from view to view in the project web browser that you could be trying to select something out of the ceiling plan versus the floor plan. So it just cleans it up a little bit, makes it a little bit easier to use. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to level 2. I'm going to right click and I'm going to rename this, and this one I'm going to call foundation plan. Go ahead and click out of there. I'll get my dialog box. Again, I'm going to say yes. Now I'm going to come down here to my building elevations, and I'm going to also relabel those. Most of the time when you're creating a project, the front of the building will not necessarily always be on the south, which in this case would be the bottom of the screen. It could be in all kinds of different orientations. And so I'm going to choose a little bit different description. So I'm going to actually come over here and right click on south, and I'm going to rename that. And I'm going to rename the south elevation to the front elevation. Again, I'm going to keep all of this in capital letters. I'm going to go to the north elevation. I'm going to rename that to the back elevation. Actually, I'm going to do that differently. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Z a couple of times. And okay, I'm going to actually do this a little bit differently. So I'm going to have you do the same. I'm going to actually go to the east elevation, and I'm going to name that the front elevation. So it's not going to let me do that because it has the same name. I'm just going to give that front elevation a different name really quickly. We'll go front elevation. Now, my west side is going to be my back elevation. My north view, I will rename to my right side elevation. And then finally, what was originally the south, I'm going to relabel that to the left side elevation. Now let me explain to you why I did change that. Is we look at this Jefferson Beach bungalow, as we draw in Revit, this lower side, which is our south elevation, is not the front of this project. The front of this project is actually on the right-hand side. So this was originally labeled east on the template out of Revit, and so that's why I decided to call this front elevation. This side will be the back elevation. This will be the right side elevation, and then on the lower hand side will be our left side elevation. So I apologize for making that mistake, but it's better that we take care of it right up front. Okay, so now we've renamed those views. The next thing I'm going to have you do is double click on your front elevation. Now, the first thing I'm going to have you take note is look up here at these tabs. I can toggle back and forth between those two views very quickly. I think that's an efficiency that came out a couple years ago in Revit that has it's a pretty profound improvement as far as I'm concerned. All right, so we're going to do a couple of other things here really quickly. So the first thing is you'll notice that my foundation plan and my main level plan, we start at elevation. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. Elevation 0, my foundation plan is at elevation 10. So the very first thing we want to do here is we want to change those elevations. Now, from a previous lecture, if you recall, we talked about in many architectural drawings, we use a standard convention where the main level floor is at a relative elevation of 100 feet. So what we're going to do is we're going to come hover right here, and we're going to activate. I'm going to have to click there twice. Let me just do that one more time. I'm going to get right in there, and you're going to have to click twice. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type 100 space 0. Remember that you don't have to have the apostrophe or the double quote right there. The way the formatting works in Revit, the first digits are always feet. You put a space, the next digits are read as inches. And I'm going to click there outside of the box, and it will be gone. Okay, don't worry that it's gone for a minute. What we're going to do now is I'm going to hover right over here, the 10 feet, and double click to enter there. This foundation plan, I'm going to have you set that at 98 space. Remember, we don't need the foot mark, 9, and I'm going to go 0.875. 0.875 is the equivalent of 7/8 of an inch, and so our elevation here is actually 98 foot, 9 and 7/8 of an inch. I'm going to go ahead and just click outside of that box. You'll notice that it disappears. Using my scroll wheel, pulling down, I'm going to scroll out. And what you'll notice is they didn't disappear, they just moved up. So when you're looking at the screen, from the bottom going up would be the same thing as going lower on the z-axis to a higher location on the z-axis. Okay, we do need to do one other thing, and we want to add another level. So right now, back here on our floor plans in our project browser, you see that we have foundation plan, we have the main level floor plan. I want to create a level that's called top of footing. So to do this, I'm going to come back here to, I think it's under architecture. At least that will work for us. So go to the architecture tab, your ribbon will show up, and if we come all the way here to the right, you'll see the little icon here, the little tool that's called level. I'm going to go ahead and activate that tool by clicking on there, and then coming down here into my main workspace, I'm going to come clear to the left. You'll notice that it actually snaps to the end of those existing levels. I'm going to click once, and then dragging my mouse to the right, I'm going to take that all the way until it snaps. I'm going to zoom in there. You can see with that little vertical hidden kind of turquoise line that it snaps there into place. You'll also know that it has an elevation there. That's an elevation based on where you actually snapped that level. So to end this command, I'm going to click again, and you will see that now I have level 3 at 95 foot 3 and 7/8 of an inch. I'm still in that level function, the level tool. I'm going to hit escape twice, and that will get me out of that function. So what I want to show you here really quick also is that you can name things from this main working space as well, or renames things. So for example, I'm going to hover into the level 3. Before I do that, just take a really quick look over here under foundation plans. Here's our level 3. So I'm going to double click right there, and I'll activate level 3. This time I'm going to type in top of footing, or maybe I'm just going to go TOF. I like to abbreviate. That's a fairly standard abbreviation in the construction industry. TOF meaning top of footing. Once again, do you want to rename in corresponding views? We're going to go ahead and say yes. And then a final thing that we're going to do right here is I'm going to take the elevation here, activate it, and we are going to now change the top of footing to an elevation of 96 foot 10. Now this time I'm going to do a space and go 3 and make a fraction 3/8, and I can go ahead and hit enter or X outside of the box, and you'll see that I have my inches and fractions, or my inches and fractions. Okay, so once we have that part done, now we have the elevations that we'll be building off of. Again, going back to what we're saying here, that when we're modeling, we're placing things. So this elevation will be at the plane. It'll be basically a horizontal plane at 96 foot 10 and 3/8 of an inch. And what we're going to be saying on this project is that's where the top of our footing is going to be. That's the elevation along that horizontal plane where that will exist. When we look at our top of foundation, or our we call it foundation plan because it turns out later on this name will become the view name when we add it to a sheet. The top of our foundation wall will be at 98 foot 9 and 7/8 of an inch. And then once again, our main level excuse me, our main level floor plan will be at elevation 100. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and in my project browser, because I don't have a tab up here, I'm going to double click on top of footing under floor plan, and you'll see that my tab for top of footing is now put up there. Okay, so now the next step, what we're going to want to do is, let me go back to our drawing here. We're going to do a little bit more setup. So at this point, we've done some basic internal setup to where it's going to make it easy for us to place the geometry, the objects into our model. But to get to that point also, from more of a layout type of context, is we are going to input what we call grid lines. So if you look right here, we've got grid lines A. If you actually have to come down here, we've got B, we've got grid line C, grid line D, and then coming on the horizontal, we got grid lines 1, 2, 3. Okay, so to create the grid line, we're going to come back up here to our architecture tab. It looks like I'm already there. And what you'll notice over here is we have this grid. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that tool. And what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click. I'm going to do this in between these 4 little elevation symbols right there. And I'm going to come about to this point right here. I'm going to click once and I'm going to drag to the right. And at this point, it doesn't really matter if you're long or short, but just try to stay within those elevation symbols. And I'm going to click again. Now you'll notice right here that by default, it is the number 1. I'm going to come back down here really quickly again. I'm going to add a second one. Notice how when you get to the left edge of the one, it snaps into place, and you can see by those vertical hidden lines. Click, and I'm going to put a grid line 3 going to the left again. Now let's add some vertical grid lines. So I'm going to come over here in the more or less the upper left-hand side. I'm going to click once, and I'm going to drag towards the bottom. Now, 2 things I want to point out here really quickly. I'm going to hit double escape to get out of that mode for a second. You'll notice that when I started with grid line 1, when I went to grid line 2, grid line 3, it automatically increased by 1 digit each time. When we come to the vertical here, you'll notice that it continued on in that numerical count. Now, the thing of it is, if you've been around drawings a lot, you'll notice that the grid lines are actually done one direction numerically, the other direction is going to be alpha, or using the alphabet. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to come into the little bubble right here, and I'm going to click twice, and it's going to activate the digit or the number 4, and I'm going to replace that with the letter A. Use a capital A. Once you've done that, it actually changes the mode. So now I'm going to go back to my architecture tab, go select my grid line, and we need to add grid lines B, C, and D. And what you'll note is if we go from the top down to the bottom, you'll see that that in a sequential fashion went to B, will go to C, and it will go to D. Now it looks like when I click there, I got a little bit long. If that happens, I can activate that. There's this little bubble right here, and I can drag that until it shows with that hidden line that it lines up. Okay, perfect. A couple of other really quick things that you can do to modify the grid lines. If I select the grid line here, take note that I can check mark that box, and now I got that bubble on both sides. I can come down here, I can uncheck mark that box. So you can manipulate how the grid lines look in terms of bubbles by going through and clicking by checking or unchecking each of those boxes. So I will come back and turn some of these off in just one second, but I just wanted to get a basic grid laid out. Okay, so at this point we have the grid lines that we need, but these grid lines are not necessarily in the correct orientation. I'm going to once again bring up our drawing here. So when we start placing our grid lines, what you'll notice right here is we've got grid line A, we got grid line C, we have a string of dimensions right there. If you add those all up, that should equal 40 feet. Um, what we want to do that when we start looking at the grid line, it's kind of like that standard convention with the main level floor elevation of being 100 foot 0 inches. What we want to do is we want to take the intersection of two grid lines and we want to make that our relative absolute point, if that makes sense. So I mean, it's relative in the sense that a building can go wherever it wants in a coordinate system. But what we're going to do is we're going to measure all of our other grid lines and all the geometry off of grid line A and off of grid line 1. So where those two grid lines cross, that will be our main reference point. So I think what I'm going to do, I think we're going to need a little bit more room up there, so I can actually drag by selecting and clicking and dragging that down. Okay, so let me show you really quickly the best way, at least the way I like to move grid lines around. The first thing I do is I put in some dimensions. So to add a dimension, you need to go to the Annotate tool or the Annotate tab. It'll open up the ribbon that will show all your tools. And right here we have aligned. So most of the dimensions that we will be using here will be the aligned tool. I'm going to click right there. That will activate my dimension. And for now, I'm just going to simply come and hover over A. I'm going to come up here towards the top to give myself some room. I'm going to click once and you'll see that I'm stringing. And when I hover over grid line B and it highlights, go ahead and click again. Do the same thing going left to grid line C. Do the same thing going to grid line D. Now, to close out of a dimension, you can if you try to click on the D here again, what you'll notice is it actually releases that point. So to exit out of the dimension, you need to move a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left and then go ahead and click again. And that will end that string of dimensions. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing down here. I'm going to go to grid line 1, grid line 2, grid line 3, and close that out. You'll notice I'm still in the dimensioning mode. To exit that, my favorite way is just to hit escape twice on the keyboard, and that will exit me out of that mode. Okay, so now that we've added some dimension lines, there's actually one other observation I want to show you here, and that is the size of the text. On the lower right-hand side, on the lower left-hand side of this main work area, you will see a dimension. By default, this template is 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot 0 inches. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to click on there and we're going to bring up our options and we're going to change that to 1/4 inch of a scale. Okay. Now what you'll see is all of that text pretty much became half the size of what it was before. Okay. Don't let that alarm you at this point. We will adjust the sizes of different things, and when we get to that point, everything will look in a good size. Okay, so what I'm going to do right here now, as I was saying before, is we're going to say that grid line A and grid line 1 is the relative location. Those lines will no longer change. And if I go back now to my drawing, what I can see right here is that I've got, this is actually going to get a little bit tricky. What I can see right here is grid lines D and grid line C. If I come down here to this dimension, so here's our grid line, the other grid lines coming off of our foundation wall. What I can see right there is we've got 4 feet. All right, here's where we actually want to start. So what we know right here is grid line A to grid line D is a total of 44 feet. So this is the key thing when you're doing this, is we want to move objects. It doesn't matter if it's a wall or a floor or a roof, or in our case, a grid line, we need to move the object. Now, it turns out that I need to create another dimension line that I'm going to come from grid line A to grid line C. I'm going to go ahead and click out of there, and you'll see, whoa, we've got 96 feet right there. So what I want to do, I'm going to actually pull my grid line C back quite a bit because I am way too big on my grid lines. But what we're going to want to do here now is I'm going to select grid line D. And when I do that, you'll notice that my dimension becomes active. Okay, if you try to click on the dimension without having an object selected, it doesn't know which object you're trying to move, and what that actually will do is put you into a dimension text mode box like this. Okay, that's not exactly what we're going to want right there. So we're going to go ahead and select grid line D, and then we're going to click on 96, and I'm going to change that back from my drawing was 44 feet 0 inches. Because it's 0 inches, I don't need to do a space and 0. I can just hit enter, and you'll see that it moves grid line D to 44 feet off of grid line A. Now I'm going to go back here once again, annotate. I'm going to add, excuse me, 2 more dimensions here. Actually, I don't need to, because I already have the dimensions up here. What we do know from what we looked at before is grid line D to grid line C was a total of 4 feet. And now the question is, what is the difference between grid lines D, C and B, or D and B? Okay. I can tell you right now, because we have 28 feet right here, and I know that grid line B was 4 feet, that's going to give us a total difference between grid line C and grid line B, a total of 24 feet. So once again, I want to move grid line B to be 24 feet from grid line C. Okay, so that now will be how we line up grid lines A, B, C, and D. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to line up grid lines 1, 2, and 3. So once again, let me go back to the drawing. And when I look at the drawing here, grid line 1, we're saying, is in the absolute correct position. What we know right here, there's actually 2 dimensions I'm looking at. Going from grid line 1 to 2, we can see off of our dimension right here, we're at 24 feet. And then grid line 2 comes off the face of this foundation wall, which is right here. So the second dimension from grid line 2 to grid line 3 is going to be 15 foot 6. All right, so what I'm going to do is go back, and remember, grid line 1 is in the correct position. What I want to do now is to move grid line 2 24 feet 0 inches from grid line 1, and then grid line 3 is what we want to move. We're going to click there, and now we're going to select the active dimension, and we're going to go 15 space 6 inches, and you will see now that that is sliding that up. Okay, so we're making some pretty good progress here. Just one last thing here. If we look at this, it looks like that we have our grid lines bubbles are on both sides of all the grid lines, other than grid line C doesn't extend past grid line 2, and grid line B in the other direction does not extend past grid line 3. So there's a couple more things I want to show you before I end this part of this video. And what that's going to be is, first off, let's just notice that we've got a lot of extra length right here on our grid lines. I'm going to click on grid line A, and if you haven't noticed so far, I'm going to show you here now that you see this little padlock. This little padlock means that when I try to move this grid line here going along this blue horizontal hidden line, it's locked in with grid lines B, C, and D. That's actually going to work to our advantage right now. So I'm going to come right here in that little circle, click, and what you'll notice is I drag one grid line to make it shorter. The other three follow suit. Now, this will be interesting because it looks like grid line 1 is not locked in with grid lines 2 and 3, but watch what happens here. I can move, whoops, didn't want to do that. Let me put that back to how it should be. I can move grid line 1 without moving grid lines 2 and 3. If I move this out, and you'll see that now I'm locked in with grid line 2 and grid line 3, it automatically locks all three together now. I can now click in that circle, go to the left, and I can now shorten those grid lines. Okay, so let me see if we can do just one or two more things here. So as I was saying earlier, grid line C does not extend past grid line 2. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to once again highlight grid line C. I'm going to uncheck mark it so my little bubble goes away. But I don't want to drag this without unlocking my padlock, because if I don't, you'll notice that all of my grid lines are moving. It's not what we want. If I unlock that, then I can simply just move grid line C to the correct location. Grid line B is the same thing. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to click, uncheck mark the box, I'm going to unlock the padlock, and now I'm going to drag that down to grid line 2. I'm also going to delete that dimension at that point. I'm going to delete this other series of dimensions right there as well. So going back to our drawing, it's hard to tell completely at this point because we will need to do a little bit of modification as far as the length of grid lines A, C, and D. But what you will note right now is that for the most part, our grid lines will be set up that we can now start worrying about placing geometry in the model. Okay, so I guess the final thing before I end this video, make sure that you always save your drawing. In fact, the best practice is once you open a project, very first thing you should do is go to File and do a Save As. And in this case right here, I'm going to save this as a project, and I'm going to save it to my own space on my own drive. So it'll take a second here. I'm going to go ahead and on my computer, I've got a special place. Go down on this PC. I've got a special place right in this place right here. that I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to name it the Jefferson Beach Bungalow, space hyphen space, and then I'm going to put my name. Okay, so go ahead and save that, and then look for the next video where I will show you how to place foundation walls.